The Beatles' second album was entitled With the Beatles and was recorded in July through October of 1963. Now, when I say July through October 1963, I don't mean it took them months to record it like they were recording every day, but remembering that at this time, the Beatles were really getting popular, and so Brian Epstein was booking them like crazy. One of the things we're going to come up against again and again, even sort of late into the Beatles' career, is the idea that nobody really understood, certainly at this point, that the Beatles were going to be the Beatles, you know. The idea was that these guys were having success and you got to make hay while the sun shines. And while you're still, you know, the flavor of the week or whatever, you got to do as much as you can, make as much money as you can, because the public could cool on you in a fickle way, you know, and before you know it, you're nobody, you can't do anything. So Brian Epstein had these guys doing tons and tons of gigs, and George Martin would always complain he wasn't getting enough time with the boys to record this music, and so a lot of times they had to sort of, you know, work a bit on the records, and then they'd go off and do some gigs, and then work a little bit more. So this, not like the first album, which was recorded all sort of in one day. Now they were trying to fit these recording sessions in, and of course the Beatles, John and Paul, doing the same thing with their songwriting, trying to find times to write these songs, whether it be in a hotel room or on a bus, this kind of thing. Anyway, recorded in July of October 1963 with the Beatles, was released in November of 1963, just at the crest of this big successful year for them. Went to #1 and is reportedly the second album ever to sell 1 million copies in the UK. And by a UK artist, that's really pretty fantastic for a bunch of guys who just a year earlier were struggling with a number 17 hit, and a year before that were playing somewhere in the Cavern Club or Hamburg. The American parallel to With the Beatles is Meet the Beatles, and that's the album that you can see all the young kids holding up when the Beatles arrive at JFK. Looks a lot like the With the Beatles cover, although if you compare the two covers, you can see there's a difference in shading and all that. But that was released by Capitol in January of 1964, actually after VJ released Introducing the Beatles, so there you go. The two albums did not contain exactly the same songs for reasons we've discussed before, and you can go online and figure out which ones were included and which ones were sliced off by the American label. Again, we get 6 covers on this album. We get Till There Was You, a song sung by Paul from the musical The Music Man. Of course, the Beatles did show tunes, and this, of course, one of those. Another girl group song from a Motown band called the Marvelettes. This one, Please, Mr. Postman, sung by John. A Chuck Berry tune, Roll Over Beethoven, sung by George. Another Motown track. The covers on this one, if the covers on the first album were awfully girl group dominated, the covers here are awfully Motown dominated. A track by Smokey Robinson and the Miracles, sung by John, You've Really Got a Hold on Me. A Donnays song, the Donnays were a girl group, Devil in Her Heart, that one sung by George. And another Motown tune by Barrett Strong called Money, that one sung by John. A lot of the tunes that they're doing are songs that other Liverpool bands were doing. You know, so Money, for example, was a real sort of stomper that a lot of Liverpool bands had done. And there are various recordings you can find by various Liverpool groups of some of these tunes. So again, we see the Beatles filling out the album material with cover versions. Significantly, none of these cover versions ever became sort of the single that they released with the intention of getting a hit, but still, you see those cover versions still. They will disappear very quickly after next week. We won't be seeing too much more cover tunes from the Beatles. The originals we have here, there are 8 of those. John's It Won't Be Long and All I've Gotta Do, Paul's All My Lovin', George's first original to appear on a Beatles album, Don't Bother Me, Little Child by John and Paul together, Hold Me Tight, written mostly by Paul, I Want to Be Your Man, which is mostly a Paul song, but Ringo sings it, and Not a Second Time, a John song. We won't talk about any of those songs in detail when I do my close-up. I'll instead focus on She Loves You and I Want to Hold Your Hand. But all of these songs really continue to use most of the general features that we saw on the Please Please Me album. That is, the songs are short, arranged and polished like we saw before. Vocals up front. Any solo you hear is short and provided for contrast. Again, the emphasis on harmony singing, especially the duet between John and Paul. Continued and extensive use of AABA form, as I said before, revealing a debt to Tin Pan Alley and American pop. And simple instrumentation and a continuation as the recording as an audio snapshot kind of approach. So in many ways, these two albums really fit together as sort of volume one, volume two of the early Beatles. We do hear some George Martin on piano, and in fact, for a long time, George Martin is the only non-Beatle to appear on Beatles records and will often be the one providing the keyboard, although Paul was certainly capable of providing keyboard, and even John at certain times too. So let's take a minute to look at a couple of those hit singles from the second half of 1963, She Loves You and I Want to Hold Your Hand.